So when Pastor Mark first talked to me about doing this message and preaching in this series, Crazy Faith, he specifically wanted me to speak on crazy faith as a chosen vessel and kind of speak through my experience and my calling and kind of walking in that. If you've been here at all over the course of this year, then you've heard me preach 2 other times. If not, then you haven't. And so basically what this is all getting up to is probably about 8 or 9 years ago, Pastor Mark started telling me that I had a calling to preach. And I was like, no, Pastor Mark, I do not. You are so wrong. Like, I'm called and I'm serving in ministry, and that's great, but that's the extent of it. And so finally, about a year ago, he brought it up again after I had told him a bajillion times, do not mention it to me one more time. And finally, like, I was mature enough and ready and, like, able to accept that. And so he was like, I want you to kind of share your story and talk about kind of how you got to where you're at, from being so against the calling to now being willing to do what God has called you to do. And so as I kind of worked through that and was planning, I realized that kind of the key to that was being planted and just staying. And so the title of today's message is Having Crazy Faith to Stay. We're going to start by reading out of Ruth chapter 1 and in verse 1. So we'll give them a second to get that pulled up. Okay. If you have your Bibles, go there, and if not, it should be right up here. In the days when judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah, and when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. So I want to take a quick second and kind of go over all that. So there's about a 400-year period where rather than Israel being ruled by kings, they were ruled by judges. And so it was kind of dependent on somebody like rising up and just taking a stand and doing what God had called them to do. And so it was really dark days. It was really bad. There's a lot of famine. And so Elimelech did what he thought would be worthy, and he left. He thought what would show great faith, and he left the land that he was in to try to go and find a better place to raise his family. And then as we see, Elimelech died, and so Naomi was just left with her 2 sons. We'll keep on in verse 4. The 2 sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone with her 2 sons, without her 2 sons or her husband. And then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return to her homeland. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she set out from the place where she had been living, and they took the road that would lead them back to Judah. But on the way, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with the security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. This is pretty interesting because they were obviously 3 widowed women. And let's see here. So, and obviously they were all childless because Naomi, her 2 sons were passed away now, and then the 2 daughters-in-law hadn't had kids yet. So in that time, to be a childless widow was basically among to be the lowest and most disadvantaged in all of the classes that you could fall into. There was no one to support you. You had to live on the generosity of strangers, and Naomi had no family in Moab, so there was no one to help her. And so that's why she chose to go back to where she came from, because she heard they were prospering there, and she had family who she could lean on since she was widowed and had no kids. So we'll keep on going. No, they said, "We want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go on with me? Can I still give birth to other sons who could grow up to be your husbands? No, my daughters, return to your parents' homes, for I am too old to marry again. And even if it were possible and I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. And so the two of them continued home to Bethlehem, and the entire town was excited to see them when they got back. But we see here, like, yeah, they did up and leave, but Naomi had the crazy faith to stay with her mother-in-law in a pretty, like, desolate situation where she could have easily had nothing. She had to depend on strangers, no opportunity on the horizon to get remarried, but she said, no, like, I know God's plan for me is to stay, and so I'm going to stay, I'm going to trust, and I'm going to do what you've called me to do, and so, or what God has called me to do. And so, I'm not going to go through any more of that book, but there's only 4 chapters. They're all really good, so you should definitely read them. And I'll quickly recap. So basically they get back to Bethlehem, and Naomi decides that she's going to go to a field of a man named Boaz and just try to harvest some grain that his harvesters had dropped, just so that way they had something to eat. And so she does that. She brings back food, and during this process, Boaz sees her, and he ends up finding favor on her and kind of like helping her out, helping her to have more food, telling his other workers to like take it easy on her, to let her keep doing that. And so after a little while, Naomi ends up telling her, like, Boaz is actually in our family lineage, and he could be somebody to, it says in the scripture, to redeem you, or to basically like remarry you and give you a chance to bear a son and to carry on our family name and provide for you. So you should definitely take that opportunity. And so Naomi goes on to instruct Ruth on exactly what to do. Ruth does it. It ends up working out in her favor. She ends up marrying Boaz. And through that, they have a baby who becomes the father of Jesse, who becomes the father of David, who is in the direct lineage of Jesus. So because of Ruth's crazy faith to stay, even in something that seems so dark and destitute, God blessed her and allowed her to be a part of the story of Jesus and have direct lineage to our Redeemer and our Savior. And so a lot of times it's so easy to recognize going as having faith. We see Abraham, and he just up and left, not knowing where to go, but just following God, and that's counted as faith. And then, we see Paul all throughout the New Testament. He started out persecuting Christians, and then God radically transformed his life, and he went wherever God told him to, and that was counted as faith. But there's also a faith in staying, even when it doesn't make sense to stay. And so I kind of want to start out and just kind of, I guess not really start out anymore, but take a moment and go through kind of my story, like I had said. So the Bible tells us that everybody is given a measure of faith. So every single person who is ever born automatically starts out with a measure of faith. And we can clearly see this because even if someone's not a Christian, everybody is searching for something. Everybody is searching for something to help them with their problems and to help them get along better in life. Or even people who are agnostic or atheists, like there still takes a level of faith to look around at a world that clearly had a creator and believe that nothing, it just came from nothing. So we're all given a measure of faith. And so that kind of looks like, in the Bible there's a lot of, In the Bible there's a lot of comparisons to like plants and trees and seeds and harvest. So, we're all given a little seed of faith, right? And it's our job to steward that well and to see something come from that. And so thankfully, I'm very, very blessed to be able to say that I was brought up in a family where both of my parents had a strong emphasis on faith. They both saw that as being an important part of their life. And so I've been in church pretty much my whole life. So for the first 7 years of my life, we were at one church. And like I said, that seed of faith was planted into my life. And in that first 7 years, I got saved at that church. I made the decision to receive Jesus. I got baptized. And so through stewarding that faith, God produced a little baby plant out of that. And so, something began to grow, and it was little, but it all came from that initial seed of faith. And as I stewarded that. Then when I was about 7 years old, my mom decided for us to start going to a different church because we were going to a Baptist church, but she was brought up Pentecostal, so she wanted us to be brought up in an environment more similar to what she was brought up in. So we left and started going to a different church. And it was awesome. We went to that church for probably about 7 or 8 years, and through that time, God connected us to people who would be a part of where we're at now. God used that time to help us make connections and put people in our life that would lead us eventually to College Park, because nothing with God is wasted. Even though we went through several different churches to land here, nothing with God is wasted, and he had a purpose and a plan for all of it. And so also, while during that time at that church, I can remember being in 8th grade, being in youth ministry, and hearing this message where the youth pastor had talked about having a graveyard experience. And he talked about, we all have a tombstone that had, like, our birth date, and then it'll one day have the date that we die. But when we get saved, we have died to ourselves and we're born again, so we get like a second set of dates on our tombstone. And it was like, because I had made the decision to get saved at such a young age, I had never really fully understood that, and so that was like a big part of my story as well. It's kind of like, I wouldn't say that I got saved again, but just helping that to really set in and like understand the decision that I had made at such a young age. And so through all that, God used that time to grow me even more. And so then the plant that started out as a seed and then grew to something tiny became something a little bit bigger. And so once I was in high school, we ended up leaving that church and coming here because it had gotten to a point where the church had kind of been dwindling down. The youth ministry didn't have a whole lot going on for kids my age. I was like the only girl in the youth ministry, and there was like maybe 5 or 6 people. And so I had just gotten to this point where like I didn't really enjoy going to church. I didn't really want to be there. And so we were like, we've got to move, and we've got to find somewhere else where you can grow and be plugged in and have community. So we visited 4 different churches, and College Park was one of them. And the reason why we visited here was because of the connection we made at Abundant Life. My very first youth pastor there was the pastor here, Pastor Jeff White. And so we started coming here and visiting because we loved Pastor Jeff, and he was awesome. And when we started coming here, this church had also just gone through a split. So believe it or not, there were like 30 people who attended here. And the youth group wasn't that large either. There was maybe like 10, 15, 20 kids, just depending. But it was a very like close-knit family kind of community feeling, and they did a lot together. And so we were like, this is the place for us. This is where we're going to go. And so we were here for a few years. After a couple of years here, our youth pastor ended up transitioning into a different pastoral role here, and then eventually to having his own church. And so we went through a couple different youth pastors, and then God brought Pastor Mark and Jennifer here to College Park. And at that point, I was a freshman in college when they moved here. And quickly, I got really tight to them because they had twin boys who were 5 months old. They were pregnant with Gracie. And they had just left all their family. They didn't know anybody. And so really quickly, like, Jennifer, for some reason, trusted me to watch her kids. Anybody who knows me knows that I love some kids. And I love all kids, but I don't like all kids. I'm not really a kid person. But Jennifer trusted me. And it was all part of God's plan. He worked it all together, and he formed us to be so close-knit to where they were more than just my youth pastors. They were an extension of my family. And so that grew and that relationship developed. And when they moved here in February, and when it rolled around to the fall semester starting back, they had asked me to just join youth staff. And before that, I had served in church. I had served in nursery or kids' church, basically, in my eyes, glorified babysitting. So this was my first real opportunity to serve and pour into people, and I don't know, it just had a different weight to it. And so all throughout that time, God was developing me and growing me and, adding new leaves to everything. And I went through hard phases. There were times in youth ministry where I felt so unqualified and God, how can you use me? Because if you've never served in youth ministry, it's crazy. You would not believe the things that middle school and high school students go through. And I was not prepared for that because I wouldn't say that I was a sheltered kid, at least not from my parents. I was more so sheltered, just because I had really strong morals and made the decision to separate myself from things and not get involved in things. And so to some extent, I was sheltered, and so there were so many things that I wasn't prepared for, and there were multiple times where students would tell me things, and I would be like, girl, let me direct you to this person because I know for a fact that they went through that, and they can help you, but I can't. And so, but anyways, through all that, God showed me that even though I didn't feel like I had a testimony, and even though I didn't feel like I had anything to pour out and to give to anybody, I did. I had a testimony of grace. I had a testimony of God's sovereignty over my life, protecting me from things that I didn't have to go through. And that even though I hadn't necessarily gone through the things that they were going through, I could show them that you can be strong. You can say no. You can make the decision to like be set apart and be different, and you don't have to look like everybody else. And so through all that grew me and developed me. And eventually, this little plant became a much bigger plant. Started to grow into a tree. And around that time, Pastor Mark, like I had mentioned previously, he started telling me, I can remember so vividly, out in the parking lot, right up near the office, we were walking out of the office from like a youth staff meeting or whatever, and he was like, Meredith, can I talk to you for a minute? And I was like, yeah, sure, what's up? And he was like, you're called to preach. You might not see it and you might not believe it, but there's something greater on you than just serving in youth ministry. Like, you're called to do much more than that. And at that point in time, I could feel God like tugging me towards doing worship, and so I knew that I was called to more, but in my mind it wasn't preaching. I was like, Pastor Mark, like, yeah, I know I'm called to ministry, like I'm serving in ministry, so I'm walking in my calling, like, but it's not preaching. So you got the wrong person. Like, I don't know, maybe that's for somebody else on the youth staff, but it's not for me. And so he left it alone, and then probably like a month later he brought it up again, and I was like, Pastor Mark, you got it wrong. That is not for me. And he brought it up another time about a month later, and I was literally so angry. I said, Pastor Mark, do not bring this up to me again. I am not called to preach. I'm serving in ministry. I'm doing what I'm called to do, and that's that. So leave it at that. Like, don't bring it up again. I'm getting really angry at you. And so he didn't. He went a long time without bringing it up. And then over the years, he probably brought it up 2 or 3 more times. And then finally, like I said earlier, I landed on it and accepted it. But there's more to growing than just, the good things and salvation and, doing what you're called to do. There's more to it than just that. There's also like hurtful things when it comes to growing. Sometimes like you get used to the environment that you're in. You're used to this little pot and you're comfortable. You're in your comfort zone, but God's calling you to more. And so he's calling you into new territory, and you have to uproot where you're at to move somewhere new. And that can be scary and like a new environment and difficult. So you go through that. Sometimes there's pruning. I can tell you plenty of times where God pruned me in my journey. I can remember one time after church, Pastor Mark and Jennifer invited me to their house for lunch. And so they're like, yeah, we're going to have lunch. We're going to play some board games. It'll be really fun. So I was like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll come up. And so get up to their house. We have lunch. We're hanging out and just kind of like sitting around, awkward silence kind of stuff. And I was like, this is so weird. I thought we were going to like play games or, what are we doing? And then out of nowhere, Pastor Mark drops a bomb on me, and he's like, so there was a girl who was in our youth ministry, and I was close to her as far as like mentoring her in youth, but also our family and her family had been close for years. And so there had been a falling out between our families, and her mom had put some dumb stuff on Facebook. And so dumb, immature college girl Meredith becomes a keyboard warrior and like gets in an argument with her on Facebook. And so everything that I said was totally warranted. I didn't say anything that I didn't have grounds to stand on or whatever, but still it wasn't reflective of who God was calling me to be. And it wasn't reflective of somebody who wants to lead people to Christ and who wants to grow the church. And so during that meeting, like Pastor Mark called me out. And it was probably like an hour-long meeting. I was bawling in their living room because I felt like he had every right to call me out the way he did, but I felt ambushed because, once again, I thought I was going to play games. And so I was like, what kind of game is this? First of all, this sucks. I don't want to play this game anymore. And so, but there's a pruning that has to happen, because through that, like, that led me to more things, and that caused me to be more cautious of things that I say and things that I do, and like recognizing that as a leader, like, people look at me differently and I'm held to a different standard. And so there's a pruning, and it hurts. It sucks when things have to be cut out of your life, but they do. They have to be cut out in order for you to grow. There was also friendships that I had to lose along the way. Most of my friends were always church friends. I had a handful of friends at school, but they were mostly just friends at school. We didn't hang out very much outside of school. And so those friendships were, if they came and went, they were pretty easy to lose because, once again, we weren't super close. But, there was a time where, like, we had a pretty large youth group here, and we had a pretty large youth staff. And there was one Wednesday night where, like, I don't remember what the issue was, but there was some kind of drama going on. And Pastor Mark literally brought all the female youth staff into the kids' ministry room, and he said, I don't know what's going on with y'all, but you're all fired tonight. So sit right here in this room, work your mess out, and if you can get it worked out, then you can be back on youth staff next week. But for this week, you're fired. And like, through that, it was like, oh my gosh, like, I wasn't even part of the drama that was going on. And I was like, what in the world? Oh my gosh. And so anyways, through that, like, there were several things like that happened with it, caused like friendships to sever. And they were hard friends to lose because they were friends who like I did life with. We weren't just friends who hung out. We were friends who did ministry together. We had a lot more invested than just like, oh, we go out to dinner on Friday night and have a good time and, watch movies and do our nails. Like, no, we spent time praying with students and like, figuring out how we can pour into somebody else. And so it was really difficult to see those friendships cut away, but it was all directing me towards the purpose that God had for me. So there's also a period of pruning whenever you're going through stuff and whenever you're growing. And so through that, it can get really difficult to want to stay. There were multiple times on my time here at College Park where I wanted to leave. Like, I had gotten to a place where I was like, God, is this still the church that you want me in? Like, I don't want to leave church. I want to be planted in a church and I want to be serving somewhere, but I just don't know if this is it anymore because, like I said, I went through a phase where I lost a lot of friends, and they were my closest friends. Other than Jennifer, I lost a lot of friends. And even though I had Jennifer and she was my best friend, she was in a different stage of life than me. She was married. She had 3 young kids. And at that point in time, our church had a lot of young families. And so there were so many times where I was like, God, I wish we had a college and career ministry. I wish we had kids who were my age and in my stage of life, and like people that I love my friends that I have here, but there's so many times that like I feel excluded, and it's not anything that they're doing intentionally, but it's just because we're in different places. And so it makes you feel isolated and like, God, is this even where you want me to be? And during that time, I was also in college at North Greenville University. And so I had a lot of like Christian friends at school who were involved in their churches. They had college and career stuff going on. And there were so many times that I was like, I'm just going to go visit their church and just maybe I'll keep going to College Park, but I'll be involved in their college and career ministry or, whatever, just to have friends who were in my phase of life. And then in that time, God brought Anna Kate to our church. So Pastor Dylan and Anna Kate had already been dating, but she was involved in another church. And so he brought her here, and we like clicked really quickly and became super close. And so it was like, I had my friends at school, but even though we still didn't have the college and career thing going on here, I didn't feel like I needed to up and leave because I had somebody else who I could hang out with on Friday night, who wasn't at the movies with their kids or like whatever. And so, anyways, just God's sovereignty and like keeping me planted here. And honestly, through all that, there were so many times that like the only reason why I stayed planted, it wasn't because of my faith. Like, yeah, I had faith in God and I knew God would bring me through. But like I said, I had no issue. Like if I had left College Park, I knew I was going to go to another church. I knew I was going to serve. I wasn't going to fall out of the habit of going to church because that's important to me. And so the thought crossed my mind so many times, like, God, I'm just going to go visit. Like, I'm just going to go somewhere else. It's going to be fine. But what would have hurt me in that is that the other churches didn't have a Pastor Mark to pull the calling out of me who I didn't see in myself. The other churches didn't have somebody who was willing to say the hard things to me that I needed to hear so that way I could grow and mature until I'm able and willing to walk in the calling that God's put on my life, and able and willing to accept that and accept the weight of that and like have the faith to stand up and just walk in that. And so there were so many times that like the only reason why I stayed, it wasn't because of my faith. It was strictly because of my relationship with Pastor Mark and Jennifer. And I'm not saying that like I put them high up and like they're God in my life, because they're certainly not. But in the New Testament, Paul says in Corinthians, follow me as I follow Christ. And so that's what I was doing. I was following them. I trusted them wholeheartedly. God had knit us so closely together. And I truly believe that even though I didn't see it, when God brought them here, when Pastor Mark first started having me serving in ministry, God took me out of the pot that I was in and he planted me into a field, because I had gotten to a point where I couldn't grow anymore in the pot that I was in. Plants, eventually they get root bound and there's nowhere deeper for their roots to go, so they can't grow anymore. And that's fine. Some plants thrive in that kind of environment, but some plants are meant to grow out of that and grow bigger, and so they're stunted if they stay in the pot that they're in. And so I believe that God used that and put me into something bigger, but through that, I was still too weak to be able to support on my own. So sometimes you'll see like in orchards, when they plant new trees, they'll tie the tree to an anchor or to another tree to help support it until it can support the fruit that it's producing. And so I believe that that's what God did in my life. He took me out and he planted me and he anchored me to Pastor Mark and Jennifer so that way they could support me and support the calling that I didn't even know I had on my life. And so through that, I just want to, it's so important to be at a church. It's so important to, like Pastor Mark has said, salvation is important, but it's incomplete if you just stick at salvation. And so I believe that it's like being at a church is important, but it's incomplete unless you get connected to someone who's going to mentor you and someone who's going to help pull you through and help guide your life and not be afraid to chisel things out of your life and call you out when you need to be called out. And a lot of times things that happen is, we have these things that get cut out of our life, and we have these areas where God chisels us, and, we can end up getting offended. We get hurt. And we're like, well, I can't believe that Pastor Mark would tell me that I shouldn't have put that on Facebook. That was so wrong of him. I'm definitely not going back to College Park Church. I'm leaving. And so people will disconnect because they get offended over something, or they lost a friend, or, something happens, and they go and try and graft themselves. Maybe they go to another church and they try to reconnect, and they just don't fit. There's not a place for them because they're out of the will that God had for them and out of the call, the place that God wanted them to grow. Or maybe they don't get plugged back in at church at all. Pastor Dylan used this analogy at Camp Wanagalugi, and I thought it was amazing. When sometimes we disconnect and we don't get plugged back in anywhere. And for a while, we look like we're fine. Like the leaves are green. These leaves are brown on the backside, but it's just the kind of tree that I picked this off of. But for a while, everything looks good. You don't see any signs of the thing dying. You don't see, everything looks vibrant. It looks like it's thriving on its own. But after a while, not being connected to the source, these leaves are they've already started curling up. They're going to start to, and I picked this branch off on Wednesday. So, and on Thursday. They're already curling up. They're already starting to die just because they're not connected to the source anymore. And let's see here. John 15, can we go there? Verse 1. I am the true grapevine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch of mine that doesn't produce fruit, and he prunes the branches that do bear fruit so they will produce even more. You have already been pruned and purified by the message I have given you. Remain in me, and I will remain in you. For a branch cannot produce fruit if it is severed from the vine, and you cannot be fruitful unless you remain in me. Yes, I am the vine, and you are the branches. Those who remain in me and I in them will produce much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me is thrown away like a useless branch and withers. Such branches are gathered into a pile and to be burned. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask for anything you want and it will be granted. When you produce much fruit, you are my true disciples. This brings great joy to my Father. I have loved you even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. So we're called to stay. We're called to stay connected. And that's not, I'm not saying that people who leave and go to different churches, like that they're in the wrong, because sometimes God really does move us. But sometimes we try to move ourselves because of an offense or because of a lost friendship. And something was said at our women's conference that has still resonated with me, and it's like, was offense given? When Pastor Mark called me out about Facebook, was he trying to offend me, or did I just take it offensively? Because he wasn't trying to offend me. He saw something in me, and he was trying to grow and develop a different kind of leader in me. And so thank God I stayed connected through that, and I didn't allow that little petty thing to cause me to want to uproot and leave. Because there have been several times where Pastor Mark has had to call things out on me just because he knows the path that God has for me, even when I didn't know it. And he saw things and was willing to say the hard things, willing to risk hurting my feelings or hurting my relationship with their family, and just willing to take that risk knowing that God was going to take care of it and knowing that I would receive it well. And he just had that faith to do that. And so as those things were cut out, I remained. And so I just want to really drive home, it's so important that you get connected. Pastor Mark always says, you're a product of your environment. Show me your friends, I'll show you your future. And so we have a lot of new faces here because our church is growing, which is so awesome. I would say, in the last 6 months to a year, there's tons of new families who weren't here previously. And so maybe you've already gotten plugged in here at our church. Maybe you haven't. But there are so many ways to get connected at College Park Church, because we do believe that you're a product of your environment, and we don't want anybody to feel like there's not a place where they fit in here. We don't want anybody to feel like they can't grow here or build those friendships that will help keep them anchored in the hard times when their faith isn't enough, because there's going to be times. There's going to be times where you're going through marital issues and you want to give up. Maybe you don't want to leave your church, but you want to leave your marriage. But because you're planted and you're anchored and you're being supported by something else, someone who can help you walk through that thing, then you can stay. Maybe you're going through a hard time and want to leave your job, or, having a crazy time with your kids, or maybe we've got foster parents here who maybe they're going through tough times with DSS stuff. But rather than up and leaving or quitting what God's called you to do, if you're connected and you're anchored and you have people who can help pull you through those things, then it's so easy to stay. It's so easy to have that faith to stay and to walk out and be who God's called you to be. I'm so grateful that I stayed, because, like I said, Anna, Kate, and Jennifer have been my two best friends, my ride or dies, but because of COVID, God brought a whole new realm of friends into my circle who, they went to church here. I knew them. They were friends, but now we're like a whole tight-knit group of us. And so it's like all those things that I had longed for all those years, God has brought because I stayed. And so, I'm walking in what God has called me to do because I had the faith to stay. And so I just want to encourage you this morning. If you're going through something hard, if you're feeling like you want to leave, whether that be a marriage or something with work or church or a million other things, get plugged in, get anchored, and have that faith to stay. I feel like we're kind of closing here, and what I just want to leave you with is, like I said, there's so many ways to get involved here at College Park Church. If you don't know, we have a young adults ministry for anyone age 18 to 35. So if you fall into that category, get connected. We do things every month. And there's people who will care about you, who will care about your situations and help you through things. We have a women's ministry. We have a men's ministry. We have a kids ministry. We have a youth ministry. We have Celebrate Recovery. If you've had a difficult life and maybe you've struggled with things, or maybe you've had a great life and just COVID's got you down and you've gone through a funk because of that, you can come along and be picked up by like-minded people who will help you overcome things. And so there's so many areas. Get involved, get mentored, get plugged in. It's the best thing you could do.